So I guess, I mean, this is supposed to be a little bit sentimental. Has anybody else had the chance to talk with Greg, to meet him?
No, fortunately not.
Yeah, well, that makes me sort of the outlier in that. But also, I'm not a very good example in some ways because this is at 2000, which is actually pretty late in the game. So I didn't know him during the Hades, RuneQuest, Call of Cthulhu years, or with the years in which Glorantha really took off. But what really, for me, this is the King book from 1981. This is the book that totally converted me to Glorantha File, and the interesting thing about it is that it is the first text that took a sympathetic view toward chaos. And although many different points of view posing as different sages are presented, there's a lot of talk about how the chaos gods are actually inversions of the forces of creation. There's a lot of existential talk about rebellion as a metaphysical act. There's a lot of very kind of creepy talk about their cult of cults, which is Nicelor, the illuminated one, who's treated as sort of the uber villain in many Gloranthan works, but looking at the mechanics that they set up for the cult, you kind of say, hey, wait a minute, these guys have a point. And so it's funny, too. I mean, here, I'll give you, I don't know if this was a, here we go, big old bolded statements here. Important, right? See this? See that bolded section, right? Mm-hmm. Huge. Contributors, editors, and publisher categorically intend that these cults be used for non-player enemy religions. Player characters should not join these cults. We recommend that player characters who join these religions quickly be put to sacrifice by non-player character priests to get them out of play. Big, bold letters. That's a rule. Yeah, well, fuck that. Because these are awesome. So it's to a teenager reading that stuff and being told that the cults of Humact, Ularia, and Ermal, who are some of the coolest gods, and only one of them was ever very well developed, Humact, in Glorantha, that those actually were probably illuminated by Nicelor and just kept it on the down low. You know, to read that stuff, you're going, oh, okay, there's knowing Gloranthan mythology, and then there's, you know, getting into it and seeing all the things that people who are into mythology won't admit. And that's explicit in that book as well. So it was at that point that I said, all right, we're looking actually at some pretty interesting, I mean, it's Californian pop philosophy, all of it. I mean, Glorantha just reeks of peyote and West Coast radicalism. But I have to admit, it draws pretty heavily on that pipe, and what it produces is pretty good for that kind of thing. And some of it, as I've written about regarding Thed, I actually consider to be very good. But anyway, I don't know. I mean, who here dug into Glorantha?
I read a bunch of stuff.
Yeah.
Some of it of the later editions of what was it? Hero Wars? No, Hero.
Right. Hero Wars and then Hero Quest.
Hero Quest.
Well,
Hero Quest
okay.
at some point. And I did read I did have some of the older books. Reading about the trolls and the troll gods and all the troll society.
Yeah, the troll stuff is amazing. Most of that was Sandy Peterson, but
yeah,
man, just to the idea of saying, all right, let's make a monstrous race, but completely understand exactly what's going on with them.
Yeah.
But
And then the totally weird elves, if you compare them to the classical Tolkien elves or something like that. All the plant creatures that all folded into one another, and it's sort of logical and it sort of fits together, and as you say, it's also someone who's been smoking a lot of peyote or whatever it was that went around. So
it's audacious in many ways, especially that early stuff with all the boobs and the sort of going for the crazy setting stuff, which at that time wasn't that common. To say things like bronze is a mind metal rather than a technological metal because it's from the bones of the dead gods. And it just is. You do go mine bronze because that is the skeleton of a dead god.
Yeah.
Done. So the sort of Moorcock level craziness was very explicit. The concept of the dream dragons, that if you
I remember them.
That what we think of as a dragon as this large malevolent reptile crouching on gold for no good reason is basically just the released id of a sleeping dragon whose dreams are so powerful that they roam about. So you get to see all the worst sides of a dragon. But we encounter it as a creature. You don't actually get to see a real dragon. So, stuff like that. You can kind of see that just came thick and fast. Hey, what if elves are plants? And yet it doesn't really feel like a role-playing setting in those early texts. People draw elves, but you can tell the artist was just sort of let free to do it. And so they draw kind of a Tolkien elf with maybe who's a little leafy. And then later somebody must have said, back when it was more in an editorial circumstance, would say something like, no, really, they need to look like plants. And then the artist would draw something that you're not really sure the artist really got. So it's not very elfy. It's planty, but it's not very elfy. And so you can see people kind of struggling with this. I think Glorantha doesn't live in its art. The latest versions, they tried super hard, and I really think it's beautiful. But for me, it lives in the spoken word. It lives in when I say, the troll looks like this, even with all those detailed illustrations with beautiful art of the trolls, I prefer to describe the impression they make rather than show a picture. Okay, see, it looks like this. I've never done that in Glorantha. It's something to me, it speaks much more to treat it like talking around the campfire. And so, in fact, I read those two books, the one I showed you, Cults of Terror, and its predecessor, Cults of Prax. These very copies, which are held together by cellophane, I might add, I read those while backpacking in the Trinity Alps. So, I literally was reading them around campfires. And so I've always associated with that kind of specific environment. But and I know, and Greg, of course, was a camper and, an outdoors kind of guy. So I feel fairly confident that that's a fairly legitimate reading. Travel plays such a huge role in those in those early texts. Characters traveling, sort of the Tolkien thing. We're going camping. We're going to go hiking, horseback riding, and camping for a while in order to go do anything. But Moreno, what was your experience with the Glorantha texts?
I discovered Glorantha when I was beginning to be rather fed up with Forgotten Realms, all the shit. And it was mind-blowing. I started reading the Avalon Hill version, so at the beginning was okay, this strange setting is interesting, but didn't grab me very much. The version of Glorantha there is in the third edition of Ranekest is very bland.
I completely agree. In the core book, it is.
In the core book.
Yeah.
But I had the luck of finding a guy who was a very big fan of Glorantha, and he photocopied each book he had, means every book of the second edition of Rankest.
Okay.
And he released this big pile of copies, and I have to say that the circumstances. I did read this book in a strange setting too, but it was very less romantic. I worked in a factory at the time, so I brought this stack of copies with me, checking the machines, and in the other side reading all the Glorantha stuff.
Well, that makes me think. That makes me wish that there had been a dwarf pack. There never was a dwarf pack, but if there had been a dwarf pack, that's where you were in one of them.
Yes, probably. There was this difference between what I did read and what I was actually able to play. And it was beginning too frustrating. So after a while, stopped buying and reading anything about Glorantha. But for a while, up to the early 90s, I think, I did buy and read everything.
I also tried to play and found that, now this was in the mid-80s, in 1983 or 84, when I said, all right, let's try this. And I had a hard time. It's a little too simplistic to blame Dungeons and Dragons. But at least the people I was playing with, that's what they wanted to do. And so for me to talk about the bronze bones of the gods, or, about capturing spirits, binding spirits, and initiating to a god or something like that really, there was no connection. And then I started talking about how the world was a lozenge and the red moon hung fixed in the sky. And at that point, they're just like, all right, what the fuck? And so we never really got very far with that, unfortunately. But it wasn't until Hero Wars came out that I was able to really get my dose of playing in that setting. And at that point, Hero Wars came out in 2000. I bought my boxed set at that Gen Con, and I spoke with Greg then. Then when I started going to Gamma Trade Show, he was really, really friendly, and we spent a lot of time talking. After that, we spent a long time on the phone periodically as I was playing Hero Wars. So I was able to kind of get this poor guy. I mean, here I was indulging 20 years or 15 years of pent up, urge to tell him how cool I thought Cults of Terror was. And so, still though, it I think led to a pretty nice friendship for a while. Ooh, I think Robbie's back. Moreno told us about, we were talking about how hard it was to actually get RuneQuest going in play, and then how I only was able to do it ultimately with Hero Wars. But I was going to talk about, I was just talking about meeting Greg in that context and spending a lot of time with him on the phone as well as in person occasionally. And this was after, I think, a lot of the subcultural crisis about Glorantha. There was a period there when everybody really cared about what was or wasn't canon. And there's even, you guys have heard the verb Gregging, right?
Yes.
It's, when your group is playing a certain way, with Glorantha and interpreting things a certain way, and then Greg tells you you've got it all wrong. And so, which I actually am kind of sympathetic to, even though being Greg was not exactly considered, is this ours or not, was sort of the question. But it led to weird things. I've talked before about how the original book is very explicit that this is built on Mediterranean and Mesopotamian culture. It's not Western Europe. It's not feudal. It's not white people. The Lunars are supposed to look like Persians. What the hell the Hjortlings are actually supposed to look like, who knows, but they aren't billed as Saxons or Celts. And so, however, you say empire and barbarians to an artist, and they're going to give you Romans and Celts. So the art really wiggles throughout the whole history, depending on who's editing the book. And of course, in many cases, whatever the artist turns in, that's what it's going to be, and that's what you're going to use. So that always struggled. But I was going to say that one of the things that always struck me about Greg was he was a literary guy, and he was philosophically very educated, so that you could start to have a conversation about something in a game, and that it would jump into a quick reference to specific philosophers was very quick and easy and automatic for him. Jared Sorensen still teases me about the time the three of us had dinner in Las Vegas at the Gamma Trade Show, which he describes as, yeah, I ate dinner and Greg and Ron talked about stuff. So we were talking about category error, and stuff like that. I remember that, but it was, you're definitely dealing with a first-class mind. Whether this is true memory or not, but he talked about how he was frustrated that RuneQuest and Glorantha had to compromise with Dungeons and Dragons in its content. Mm-hmm. And I talked about how I had perceived Pavis as being D&D land in Glorantha, so that people who wanted to go play killing monsters and collecting treasure, they could go over to the big rubble and go do that, and leave the rest of Glorantha alone. And he said that he always liked it much better playing dramas about the rebellion and less, and he was frustrated that a lot of people who played came in saying, okay, how do I level up? But I don't know how frustrated. He just recognized it as a tension, and that was necessary to the material at the time. But what other material, have people run into? Herman, you've encountered tons of the material. Mm-hmm. What is some of your thoughts about the range in question, or the contribution to gaming, I guess, is what I'm looking for.
Well, there was the first time I came across the Glorantha in the RuneQuest and the RuneQuest system it was sort of like something opposed to what Dungeons and Dragons was at the time, which we played the most in our play group, because that's what we did, and that's what we all fell back on every time when we tried something else. But it was different, and there wasn't the levels, and it was sort of felt more natural to play that, apart from the Glorantha mythology and stuff. So game design wise, it was something which seemed to be a bit more realistic, if you could put it that way.
Well, they tried hard for that. Yeah. They were oriented. The first rulebooks make a lot of reference to the Society for Creative Anachronism that a lot of them were active in, and I remember that as a kid that I was really big on the West Coast of California.
Yeah, I know them. I'm a member myself. So.
Oh, okay. All right. So
from the European bit, which came along with the Americans. But.
So a lot of the fumble tables and stuff like that reference those experiences. They also read a lot of Norse sagas. It was the first. It was not the first gaming rulebook I read with a really serious bibliography, but it was one of them.
Yeah,
and it was particularly specific when it referenced Conan. It was very specific about Robert E. Howard. When it referenced the Norse sagas, like Njál's saga in particular. It was very specific about what it was getting from each of these. And you can tell. I mean, there's a reason it was called Limb Quest. Because half your adventures were going to get your limbs stuck back on by the priestess. Robbie, were you familiar with that?
No.
The mechanics of early RuneQuest were very prone to amputation.
Yeah. Well, and Pendragon is not really nice in terms of your wounds. It takes a long time. If you get wounded in Pendragon, you've got a long.
You got to sit out for a season, or something like that. Yeah,
or more if you're unlucky. Yeah.
I mean, I'm thinking of Mallory too. Somebody takes a head wound and they're just out for years. So that's. RuneQuest struggled with it because nobody likes their character to get decapitated quite that easily. And yet when we played RuneQuest quite recently, when Gordon and I played RuneQuest in a different setting, but using the toolbox for the runes, it was far less painful to play than I had anticipated.
Yeah, the rules really worked much more smoothly than I mean, there were things I'm not sure. Still not sure I understand strike rank and exactly when to use it and how to use it. And, there's different things in there that are that trip you up a bit, but it was fundamentally very sound.
Right. And I was a little bit.
The toolkit. It was really impressive how well that worked out.
Yeah. So the what I remembered as a teen was that RuneQuest was what the sort of here for the fantasy people played. By the time I was in high school, the women I knew who were college age, who were role players, they all played RuneQuest. I think in a lot of ways, though, it must have been frustrating because you put out this material for other people to use and it would come back in odd forms, which is only to be expected. But certain things just never seemed to take root. The dwarves, I mentioned the dwarves, for example. They never could get. They wanted to reference the dwarves as being mechanistic beings of some kind. But they could never quite, what did they look like? Were they robots? Were they, earthen golem type things? Were they made of rock? Were they, and then other artists would, of course, draw your pipe-smoking bearded dwarf, and that's what you got, and that's how it is. And so, I think people struggled with that. I'm not sure. I mean, after a while, they stopped using elf and dwarf entirely. Just say they're Aldriami and Mostali, and that's it. We're not even going to try because it just gets us into trouble. But you also had a period where I think Greg was not particularly invested or involved in the 80s when most of the material was being re-edited and reworded. I've written before about how the Avalon Hills Lords of Terror, which is their rewrite of Cults of Terror, really, in my opinion, drains it and sort of Cthulhuizes it. So now it's all pretty much of a part with that kind of horror fantasy. and much of the kind of pop mysticism and weird, maybe they're okay after all, we're just looking at it wrong, approach was gone. And so I don't know. I mean, I can't speak for Greg, obviously, but for a while, I mean, I know that when all these legalisms got resolved in the late 90s and Glorantha became his IP, no one else's, done, the word RuneQuest went off to go do something else for a while. And he and Robin Laws did Hero Wars. I know that was very much a gathering together. He got together kind of handpicked people who he felt actually could articulate things appropriately. And I still think that some of those Hero Wars materials in the small paperbacks, the Guide to Glorantha, I thought was particularly excellent. And it had that same quality. A lot of people don't like those books. They are not easy pick up and play books. You're supposed to read them. And I know that everybody who's tried to write RuneQuest / Glorantha has struggled with, what are we doing? Are we entering this world of fiction and myth, or are we sitting down to play, a fantasy role-playing game? Has anybody seen the latest version from the Chaosium of today that's UK based?
I've seen the bits they had this promotional material out, and
right.
I'm sort of like planning to get it, but haven't gotten around to it yet.
And they've done more than one Kickstarter for the materials, and I happen to have the PDF for both HeroQuest and RuneQuest, as they stand today. The RuneQuest material is beautiful. I mean, they're both very beautiful, and they're both well written, and they're both, they put a lot of effort into these. But I was blown away by RuneQuest. I was trying to tell Michele that he needs to do it in Italian, and he took one look at 448 pages and told me to go screw myself. So I was saying, no, really, if you ever do something that's 450 pages, this is it. So I don't know. I don't think he listened.
Maybe I didn't misheard, but I heard you say, okay, Rankest is good, but that I read Rankest. One of the two should be HeroQuest?
Oh, well, no. What I'm saying is that there's two publications from the Modern Chaosium, and they're two very different games. And okay. So, and they focus on RuneQuest is kind of the more, they went back, they went back to the original. Mm-hmm. They went back to this, and they said, we're going to treat this as, people who've been through it all in role playing, and we are going to really try and make this into a playable document and sand out all its warts, but try to keep it alive. We're not going to try to kill it. We think the Avalon Hill version killed it, and we don't want to kill it. We're going to fix it, but we're not going to kill it. So, and I think they did a really good job. They also took the HeroQuest game and they recast it in a slight rules revision and have also presented it. So they're both Glorantha, but they're dedicated to different aesthetics and modes of play in terms of techniques. And they knew what they were doing. They said, this runs this way and this runs that way, and that's fine. That's okay. We are celebrating Glorantha, and there are two really, really great ways to do it. Have a good time. So it might be a little confusing for people who think that this is about the better game is great and the other one sucks, and you have to, and it would be good if you did the better one and not the suck one. But that's not the way they look at it. So I thought that was good. So maybe that clarifies a little bit.